Hello, my name's Phil Winder, and welcome to another interview. Today I've got Charles Humble, who is a freelance writer, and he wrote an article on AI strategy a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was so good we should talk to him a bit more. So, hi Charles, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. Hi, good to be here.
Excellent. Could you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself? What's your background? What are your interests?
Yes, absolutely. So I've worked in IT for about, 30 years, I think, at this point. So I started actually in desktop support many years ago, and kind of gradually made my way up. So I was a programmer, and then a senior programmer, and then an architect and a CTO. And I did a startup which got acquired about, nearly a decade ago now, and then kind of moved into writing more. So I was chief editor at InfoQ for about 6 years. And then I was chief editor at a cloud consultancy firm called Container Solutions, and I did that for about 3 years. And now I mostly do freelancing work. So I write for people like O'Reilly and the New Stack. I do some sort of small, usually startup size consultancy. So a lot of that is kind of strategy work. And a certain amount of marketing stuff. And I do, as you said, quite a lot of writing for various different publications. So that's kind of my background. So quite a lot of that strategy work, but obviously coming from a fairly sort of deep technical background as well.
Okay, interesting. So your article kind of goes on to talk about enterprise strategy and its
Mm-hmm.
use in AI. I guess let's start with an introduction. Why should an enterprise or any company have an AI strategy?
Well, right. Well, so there's two answers to that. I think AI as a sort of field, as a discipline, is changing the nature of certain parts of business to a certain degree. Exactly how much is a little bit unclear at this time because it's very new and nascent, but it's one of those situations where you have what is, to all intents and purposes, a new set of techniques, a new set of technologies, which are enabling companies to do things that just weren't possible before. That has two effects. So it means if you're an incumbent, if you're a company that's well established in a particular field, you have the possibility of somebody new coming into the market and effectively disrupting the space you're in. So that's one answer to the question. But the other answer to the question is that it may allow you to develop new products, new ideas that you weren't, or perhaps to save costs, but it'll be one or the other, possibly both, that you just weren't able to do before. So it's one of those moments that it's obviously it's very new. The exact capabilities are still being worked out, but it has tremendous potential. What I would be careful of though is saying, effectively we've got to kind of shoehorn AI in somewhere. I think that's always a mistake. I think it's always a mistake if you start with a technology and work backwards. Like, what problem can I solve? You're much better off identifying problems that need to be solved and then maybe thinking about what are the technologies that work here and might AI be one of those technologies. Too often, I think people think of strategy as being that sort of very top down, we are going to use technology X and that's going to make some huge difference, but it won't necessarily. It'll only make a difference if it's going to actually allow you to solve a problem that your particular business, that your particular situation has. I think what's interesting about AI is uh, because it's so new, we're still figuring out what all of those situations are, so what all of those use cases are. And that in turn applies a bunch of things about running, allowing people to run experiments, to try things, to see if it works for them or doesn't. And that has all kinds of implications. It's very, very reminiscent of cloud adoption from, say, a decade ago,
Yeah.
in the sense that cloud adoption required a huge amount of sort of changes at an organizational level to do it well, to do it successfully, that weren't immediately obvious. And there's a lot of that, I think, with AI as well. It's a lot of, letting people try stuff and accept that not everything's going to work out, and that's fine. But as I say, the key to any strategy actually is, what are your objectives? What are the problems that you're trying to solve? And then thinking about, how do I does this particular technology enable me to do a thing that I couldn't otherwise do?
Okay, perfect. So I guess the main themes then, which I think we'll probably touch on throughout all of these questions, are sort of firstly, you sort of focusing on innovation. It's the idea of
Mhm.
AI as another tool in our toolbox to help innovate. So that's the first part. I guess the second part, which you touched on at the end, is um, the idea or the realization that the use of AI has quite ground shifting implications for the rest of the business, like the cloud did. So yeah, okay. So let's dig into those. So the first question then is how how should one of our listeners today, how should they ensure that their AI strategy aligns with their business strategy? At what point do those things intersect? And yeah, what do we need to be careful of?
Right. Yes. So again, I think that's a great question. So there are various places where the various AI capabilities may give you an edge. It's fundamentally you need you as I say you need to start by, I mean, it sounds really obvious, but you need to start by actually having a strategy. So an awful lot of strategy work is spending time trying to understand what's really going on, what will make a meaningful difference. I think people often get confused by, we'll make a SWOT diagram or something like that's going to help, and it really isn't. So I think the starting point has to be really clear about what the objectives are, and then think about how that aligns with the current technologies. So if you're talking about developing a new product, for example, or a new capability within an existing product, obviously you start by talking to customers or potential customers. And again, I'm constantly surprised when I talk to some of my clients about how little customer conversation actually goes on. But what you want to try and do is understand what their pain points are and what are the things that you can address. And what you're looking for is essentially, where should I be investing? There's a technique I've found quite helpful, which is something called Wardley mapping. So Simon Wardley is quite well known now in the strategy field. And what that does is it gives you a way to understand the environment. It's not a particularly easy technique to learn, but it has some advantages because it kind of depersonalizes conversations. So you end up with a diagram or an entity, a physical thing that you can discuss and dissect, and that gets you away from that feeling that you sometimes get in exec teams where you feel like you're kind of attacking each other because someone's got this idea but there's nothing behind it. So that's the first thing. And then you think about, well, where might those AI capabilities give you an edge? So AI might reduce costs by automating routine tasks. You might have a supply chain logistics problem, it might improve there. It might optimize resource use in some way. Or, as I said earlier, it might allow you to develop a feature that you couldn't develop. So just as a small example, but when I was chief editor at InfoQ published a huge amount of video. It was about sort of 20 hours of video a week. And the difficulty with video, we're talking sort of 10 years ago, is that it's very hard to index and search and discover because you can't index video because it's not text, and search mostly works on text. So I looked at whether we could do some sort of or some sort of transcription service using natural language processing type techniques. And we did some experiments with it. And at the time, the results weren't good enough to actually use. The stuff that was coming out was just too many errors. But fast forward about 4 years, and the next generation of machine learning tools got to the point where transcription was actually pretty good, and services started to spring up where you would have someone that was effectively like a human reviewer at a very low cost point. So you got to a point of about sort of $1 a minute or something like that, and that suddenly became plausible. So there, I had the example, the idea, and sort of proved it out in theory about 4 years earlier, but the tech wasn't quite there yet. Fast forward 4 years, it's I can revisit that now. I know it turns out that that's actually a thing we can do. And we ended up being able to do full transcription and publishing full transcription for video. So as I say, understanding what the capabilities are, I think, is the important thing. And then thinking about, well, what am I doing? Am I optimizing for cost, or am I optimizing for features? I don't mean you can do this two at the same time. Again, people try. I think it's generally a mistake. Either you're building something new or you're trying to optimize your cost base in some way. AI might be useful in both of those situations, but you kind of need to pick the one that you're doing. If it's a product thing, always start with the customer and go from there. So resist the temptation to start with technology and look for a problem. It can work, but it mostly doesn't. Conversely, if it's a cost saving thing, then possibly starting with the technology might actually be a way to go. Certainly, if it's like a supply chain thing or anything where you're trying to optimize resource use in some way, AI can actually be a very helpful starting point there, I think.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I like the way that you're framing it in terms of an optimization problem and deciding one thing to optimize. Yeah, because I like in the AI world, obviously we're optimizing for a target effectively, and yeah, if you have conflicting targets, then sometimes you can end up just shooting yourself in the foot by yeah trying to balance two things that are in a zero sum game, so you end up like not really doing well in any of them. So that's interesting. Um,
Yes, absolutely.
so I think moving on then to more questions about like what people actually need to be able to start executing on some of their ideas. Then, so at the heart of all AI projects is the underlying data, and one of the bottlenecks that we often see is either the lack of availability or the lack of quality. Is there any
Mm-hmm.
what can a business do to begin to solve some of those problems even before they're potentially thinking about using AI?
Yes, absolutely. So, yes, I mean, there's that old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. It applies just as well to AI, I think, as it does to anything else. If you've got rubbish data, then all AI is going to do is kind of amplify some of the problems you've already got. And that's can be expensive. It also can introduce a huge amount of technical debt. So most data is affected by noise. There are things you can do with, say, aggregation, so averaging, smoothing, regression, filtering, those sorts of things. Obviously, sometimes noise can be an anomaly, which is useful or interesting in some way. You can often get into trouble by making assumptions about the data up front, which can be hard to deal with later on. So cleaning data, having automated testing, understanding the data are all useful. So visualization is a helpful way to understand things. You can use, histograms, scatter plots, correlation plots, those sorts of things. Try and keep as much detail as possible with the data and preserve versions. So essentially treat your data like it's immutable rather than updating and deleting stuff. Version it. What else? Yeah, consistency, data consistency is another classic. So, dates and times are incredibly difficult to deal with, even in the 21st century. You also need to look out for consistency in terminology with what you do. So, order fulfilled can mean different things to finance, to warehousing, to the returns department, and so on. So, there's a lot of, it's not very glamorous work, but there's a lot of stuff that up front, which is really just cleaning the data, understanding the data, making sure that you've got some kind of repeatable automated testing type process for it. Data historically has been quite neglected. I think the whole sort of DevOps movement got very good at focusing on code and was rather less good at focusing on the data end of things. And we're just sort of starting to catch up a bit. But it's a lot of the same sorts of techniques that you would apply to any other problem, any other scaling problem. It's making sure that the data is reasonably consistent, the terminology is consistent, the data is reasonably clean, or where it isn't clean, that's understood. And as I say, trying to make sure you keep as much as you can. So if you're doing something like aggregating in some way, averaging out something or whatever, then make sure you hang on to the source data for that, so you can refer back to it if you need to. I think that's probably the main things. Again, I think it's a mistake to focus too early on the actual technology beyond that sort of pipelining process. I.e., I don't think your database choice necessarily matters very much, at least to begin with, and those sorts of things. It's really just a matter of making sure you've got. I mean, it's not trivial, and I don't want to imply it is, but it's really just a matter of making sure that you've got you've got the data you need up front, and you can start running exploration in a reasonably sound way. I mean, you've probably done more in this than I have, to be honest. So, what's your experience been?
Yeah, well, I was going to provide a bit of a rebuttal to that, actually, because one of the biggest challenges in all of this is it's very easy to say keep all of your data, but unfortunately, it takes effort and time in order to curate that data, and very often
Mm-hmm.
you don't. So yeah, sorry. So the first point is that data management takes effort, and so you have to invest time and money in order to do that. That means that then there's a cost constraint. There's not an infinite amount of time or money that you can spend on doing this, and so you have to select a subset of your data that you want to keep for posterity. And unfortunately, you don't
Mm-hmm.
know what you don't know. You don't know what you might need in the future, and so you end up with just two things happening. You either end up with people thinking one end of the spectrum, let's just keep everything, and it just gets dumped in some storage somewhere and never ever seen again. It never sees the light of day again. I had one
Yeah.
enterprise client a few years ago that it made a big. They advertised the fact that actually that they had this massive machine in the Netherlands that was basically a robotic tape reading machine because they had a library
Mm-hmm.
of millions of tapes with historical data on, and they wanted to try and extract some value from that. And so they had a big sort of vending machine thing that would go in and load it in and then put it back again. So that that's
Yeah.
the level of extreme that some people can go to sort of just store data for storage sake. Yeah, and then on the flip side, you get the other people that are really you know clever with the data. They do clean it, they do curate it, they do maintain it, and then you finally get to the use case and you find actually we didn't need that, we needed this. So yeah, I think it's one of those things that's quite easy to say, but it's actually really really hard to do because you've just no idea what you're going to do in the future. The only
Yeah.
benefit these days is that storage tends to be really quite cheap, so it's
Yeah.
not costly to store, but it's very easy to kind of lose track of what you've got and where it is because there's just so much of it. So I think the only sort of path forward there is yes, try and store everything, but have some easy, simple, limited amount of data curation to allow you to find it in the future when you need it.
Yes. Yeah. And it is an art. I think it's one of those things that it's very hard to get the balance right, and you will make mistakes, and you will suddenly go, if only we kept that would be really helpful now, or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. As you say, the good thing is the cost of storage has come down, so it's more realistic than it used to be to store stuff. But you're right, you can't keep everything, I think.
I think so. You also have to bear in mind that data is also a little bit of a liability as well, because I mean it
Mm-hmm.
depends on your data. If you're storing anything that has personal information, for example, that's subject to GDPR related regulation, and so you need the ability to delete that when people request it, things like that. And if you don't know what you've got in your data, it can be very hard to actually like demonstrably prove that you have deleted the data. Other things are
Yes.
like if somebody ever got access to that data and they shouldn't have access to that data, that could be a really rich source of ammunition for that person potentially. So there's a security risk there as well. So yeah, data is a little bit of a liability as well. So yeah, be careful.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Um, okay, yeah, good stuff. Moving on then. So I think another thing that today's businesses are potentially struggling with a little bit is that like you said previously, one of the key things that you need to do after you have begun your product development or your cost optimization exercise or whatever it is, you kind of need to know the use cases. You need to know where AI can be best applied, and that requires some level of expertise, some level of
Mm-hmm.
experience in AI. And I think that that's potentially one
Mm-hmm.
area where businesses could struggle because it's a new industry. So how do you think businesses can tackle that?
So yeah, so roles related to generative AI have increased rapidly. I ran some numbers on this a little while ago, and since about 2019, you've seen more than 100% increase in job postings. So that's obviously driven by increased interest and investment in the field. Pretty much every role in generative AI has seen a notable rise in demand, and it's particularly for individual contributor roles. So I think what that tells you is basically organizations are looking at scaling and expanding their internal capabilities to harness the potential, particularly for generative AI. And that in turn is leading to a sharp increase in demand for data scientists, software engineers, data engineers, all sorts of things that you would expect. So there is a bit of a war for talent going on. In terms of actually hiring technical roles, I don't think it's that different hiring a data scientist or a machine learning person than it is for any other technical role. But it is again one of these things that I think we tend to focus a lot on the wrong things. And I was reading a book very recently on systems thinking by somebody called Diana Montalian, and that kind of crystallized something which I've thought for a long time, but hadn't really been able to articulate. So she talks in the book a lot about the difference between knowledge flow and knowledge stock. So knowledge stock is essentially what you know. Knowledge flow is how information flows through an organization. Typically, when we're hiring technical roles, we focus a lot on knowledge stock, i.e. what somebody knows. And part of the reason for that is because it's really easy to test in front of a whiteboard, I think. Obviously, for a field like this, which is quite specialist, having a good understanding of the foundations is important. But I would argue that it's every bit as important that you're able to communicate that, get that, disseminate that information out within the organization, and so on. So I think there are ways that you can sort of test for that within an interviewing context. But it's not immediately obvious. And I think interviewing is one of those skills that you can teach people how to do it, but people don't necessarily know how to do it instinctively. So the first thing I would say is if you're looking to build up any technical function in the organization, but particularly something that's new, where you don't necessarily have a lot of people already, make sure that the people that are doing the recruiting, that are doing the interviewing, or whatever your process is, are sort of trained to understand how to do that well. Look for people who understand the foundations, but also look for people who are able to share knowledge with other people rather than kind of holding it to themselves. If you don't have anybody, or if you're trying to go the other way and effectively take some people that are technical in another area, perhaps they're very good programmers, and you're trying to get them up to speed with machine learning, I think that's a really good situation to bring consultants in, because the consultants, it's one of the roles of a consultant is effectively to disseminate knowledge out. So it tends to be what we're hiring for. In any consultancy field, I think that's true. And that can then allow, it gives you like a rapid on-ramp for the people that you're trying to train up, who are maybe coming more from the sort of traditional computer science type backgrounds or programming type backgrounds. So I think that can work quite well. And then there are other techniques you can use, sort of the temp to permanent hire is certainly a method. I think it's fine so long as you're explicit with people that that's what you're doing. So basically you bring someone in on a 3-month or a 6-month or a 9-month contract and assess at the end of the contract and maybe make them a permanent offer or not. Those sorts of things can be quite helpful as well. But yeah, in general, I think what you're looking for is people who can learn stuff, who have that sort of experimental mindset, because so much of what you're doing in machine learning is basically running experiments. You're trying things, seeing what works. There's a lot of iteration. And people who are willing to share and communicate and talk, because it's still a new field. There's still, we don't know a lot of stuff yet. So there are still sort of new aspects to it.
Okay, yeah, good tips. Thank you. So continuing the discussion on strategy then at a high level, I think one of the things that even myself, when I'm talking to my potential customers, one of the hardest things to define is the return on the investment. Like at what point, like is it a pure numbers game? Is there more to it than that? So have you thought about and how would you recommend that people prioritize projects based upon the ROI, or what thoughts do you have about the ROI of an AI project?
Yeah, it is quite difficult, this. I mean, having a clearly defined ROI up front is a good place to start. And again, that sounds obvious, but it's surprising how often people don't. What are you expecting to see? Another good question is, can you verify without doing the whole investment? And for some, that doesn't, it's not going to work for every project, but sometimes there are sort of like smaller scale experiments you can run that verify that what you're doing is moving you in the direction you're expecting it to move in. Because one of the things you find quite often with anything that's sort of somewhat strategic is people correctly identify the pain point or the bottleneck or whatever it is, and then they try something and it's sort of it's counterintuitive and it ends up making things worse rather than better. At an organizational level, I've said a couple of times that AI is kind of experimental in nature, so that does mean you need things like sort of psychological safety in mind. You have to accept the fact that not everything you try is going to work out. And that in turn means you need to have a hypothesis that you're trying to verify for an experiment. So make sure you've actually defined what you're expecting to see. If it is a return on investment thing, make sure you've actually got numbers down and you're trying to verify those numbers as you go. But it does get difficult. I mean, again, with something like a large reinforcement learning project or something like that, there's so much work that has to be done up front before you see a return. And sometimes it is one of those situations where it's just like, well, we're just going to have to go all in and see what happens, and we're okay with that. But I do think it's understanding what the costs are, understanding what the pain is, and understanding what the potential is, and doing that work up front so you know what you're trying to do, and then measuring against what you're trying to do. I think that's probably the sort of the best sort of generic advice I can give, really. Like all of these things, it does awfully depend on your situation as well.
Mm.
But again, so often what I find is people have an idea, and the idea is interesting, but they haven't really stopped to think, well, if this works, what does that mean? what does success even look like? And so spending the time to actually define that. So it's like verifying any hypothesis. If you don't have a expected outcome or a goal of some kind, then you're really just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what happens. If you've actually got something you're trying to verify, then it becomes more, it becomes a little bit more scientific in a way, and you can actually test what you're doing.
Yeah, and in some ways, you touched on it earlier. It's very similar to just basic product development. It's the same thoughts, it's the same ideas. You don't want to build the whole business, the whole product before trying to verify that it's going to work. And the way in which you do that is by chunking the work up and iterating as best as you can, and course correcting at each point in time. And you can generally do that with AI projects, even complicated ones like RL projects. You can work in small steps and do small things and prove out the beginnings of the value before you commit to the full thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, totally agree. Okay, so another big thing that we touched upon then was the potential use cases and the need to kind of have a broad general understanding of how and where AI can be used. People, for better or worse, tend to, well, no, let me say that again, actually. Edit that out, people. So what am I trying to say? So one of the areas where people often struggle I've said people again. I'm trying to basically say I want to talk about use cases, but I want to get onto the topics as well. We've kind of talked about these specific technologies, RL, MLOps, Gen AI, and stuff like that. So I kind of wanted to talk about that. Maybe I'll just ignore the use case angle at all and just talk about Gen AI, actually, because I think we probably need to touch upon it. Okay, all right. Cut. So one of the hot up and coming areas is obviously Gen AI, and that's got a lot of businesses interested in AI in general, which is great. But I'd like to touch upon how Gen AI is potentially affecting businesses, how that affects the strategy, the AI strategy that the company has. What are you seeing in your experience that companies are thinking about Gen AI?
Right. Yes. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's sort of the kind of the current thing, the current set of technologies that's got a lot of attention. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because you can do a lot of work with some of the foundation models, whether that's from OpenAI or Google or any of the other companies, or indeed increasingly with some of the open source kind of alternatives to those. In fact, I think in some cases the open source options are as good or even better. Um, there are a lot of places where generative AI is proving useful, and some of those aren't the ones you would expect. So, for example, there's a company called Recursion, which is a biotech company, that's developed a generative AI platform that it's using to sort of accelerate drug discovery. And basically, what it does is it allows scientists to simultaneously access a whole bunch of different machine learning models that can process a lot of biological and chemical data sets. And they say, I mean, again, it's what they're saying, but they say that it's allowing them to save time during drug development, which is interesting. The more common things tend to be around sort of customer service agents, those sorts of things. So Nubank, for example, has an AI virtual assistant that focuses on delivering personalized credit related options within their ecosystem, as it were. And so basically what it does is it helps customers to understand their credit card uses. It allows them to explore credit opportunities to use online payment things without affecting their credit limits in some cases. And it can also do things like offer personal loans based on a customer's profile and eligibility. So those are sort of some of the areas. I've also seen companies that have, for example, very complicated machinery out in the field where there's thousands of pages of documentation that a field engineer is supposed to read. And you can potentially train an agent on that, and then the person out in the field can ask questions and get sort of reasonably reliable answer back rather than flicking through a 2,000-page manual or whatever it is. So there are a variety of situations where it might apply. Again, I think we're just getting to grips with some of those in an enterprise state or in an enterprise place. But yeah, those are some of the ones certainly some of the ones that I've seen. The big plus of a lot of this sort of generative AI stuff is you can try stuff relatively cheaply because you can use what's effectively an off-the-shelf model. You might customize it a bit or train it a bit, but you don't necessarily need to start from scratch every time, which is interesting. And there's this sort of parallel thing of we use the term on a blog that we did on the Windows site of small language models, where basically you're taking your own data and doing training on that rather than necessarily training on the entire contents of the internet or whatever, which is obviously rather an expensive way to go about it. So those are some of the things I've seen. There are quite a few. I listed one or two others in the article that I did. Customer support seems to be one of the ones that's getting a lot of traction. And the perennial problem of discovery, so document discovery, is another one that sort of crops up quite often, I think. Mm-hmm. You see it sometimes in a legal context. Again, anywhere where you've got huge amounts of unstructured data that you're trying to get information about, it can be potentially very helpful. And the thing where it's not realistic for someone to sit there and read the whole thing, or it's just going to take too long, then a generative AI type approach might, as I say, might give you an edge, might give you an advantage. Obviously, there are challenges with it. You do need to verify. You need to check what's coming out the other end. And we have seen companies come unstuck with that. But yeah, in general, I think it's a case of, I say, anything where you've got a large corpus of unstructured data, that's a potential place where generative AI might be useful for you.
That's right. And that goes back to our discussion about storing large amounts of data for posterity. And yeah, that's one of the key use cases for Gen AI is to expose and utilize that data. Again, it works specifically well with text-based data, but it can also work with other data types as well. So something you kind of touched upon in one of those use cases there was the idea of using customer data as part of the recommendation. Especially in the financial context, there's a large amount of financial regulation specifically around recommendation, and that's exactly what chatbots are doing effectively.
Yes.
So I think that it's going to be interesting to see how people deal with the regulation, especially when it comes to Gen AI, because it's so generative. That's the whole goal there. But I guess talking more broadly and generally, I think there's with more people starting to use these technologies, we kind of need to re-emphasize the need for some kind of strategic level governance of these products and software and models, to ensure that the business is going in the right direction. So, what do you think? What do you think businesses need to do at a governance level with respect to AI?
So yeah, so the scope of data governance needs to expand beyond privacy to address the sort of interconnected threats that you get from data poisoning. It's one of those things that sounds really easy, but it's not. So this is things like tampering with the training data. You've got things like model hijacking, so taking control of an existing model and manipulating it to perform unauthorized tasks. That might get you into sort of data leaking problems and those sorts of things. So it's one of those transitions that requires some quite robust data practices, thinking about maintaining data quality, thinking about tracing, being able to effectively trace the data lineage. And I think as part of that, the whole sort of fairly nascent area of explainable AI probably feeds into this. So that you can understand what the model is doing and how it's working and what assumptions it's making. Again, there's a lot of really interesting work going on in here, but it is very new. And I think we don't necessarily yet have all of the techniques that we need. But it's thinking about, well, how do I make sure that I'm, reducing biases in my data, fostering trust in my data, all of that sort of thing. And I think being able to understand what your model is doing and how it's making the decisions that it's making are part of that. There's also there's a whole aspect of testing in AI is really interesting, because so much of what we've done in software in general is working with fairly deterministic systems. That a normal computer program is fairly predictable. There are sort of strange things that happen as a result of, I don't know, a network failure or something unexpected in data or whatever. But inherently they're quite reproducible, and that's much less true with a system that is less deterministic in nature. So again, there are some really interesting aspects of that I don't think we have all of the answers to. A lot of it's going to come down to, as I said, maintaining data quality, making sure you can trace the data, making sure that you understand what your model is doing and how it's working, looking out for potential biases and unexpected things in the data. And there are all sorts of cases. There's a book, it came out quite a few years ago, but it's well worth reading. This book by somebody called Cathy O'Neill, called Weapons of Mass Destruction, where she looked at all kinds of situations where machine learning models were being applied in ways that weren't really statistically valid, that were having quite drastic effects on people's lives. So things like, whether you might get a loan or not, or whether you might be allowed out of prison in America, or how long your sentence might be, all of these kinds of things. So I think you need some sort of ground truth that you can refer back to as far as that is possible. So what am I expecting to happen? But yeah, it's genuinely difficult. It's very easy to say, we need to expand data governance beyond privacy. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. Actually, there's a lot there. Again, I think this is a really important role for consultancies, because it's one of those areas where seeing what other businesses are doing and being able to sort of pollinate that across different companies, I think is really helpful. Of course, there is a lot. I mean, you've talked a lot about this on the Windows site, but there's a whole bunch of AI-specific regulation coming through, at least in Europe. There's a certain amount happening in the US as well. So there's a lot to just keep in front of or keep on top of in terms of what's happening, so that you don't end up, effectively accidentally doing the wrong thing. So yeah, that's a fairly long way of saying it's quite difficult. This
Classic
there are
engineering.
challenges.
It's difficult and it depends.
Yeah.
Classic
Standard
consultant.
consultant answer. Yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
depends. But yes, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
But
interesting.
you
I
do
think
have
so.
new
I think
threats.
all of that is true, and I agree with all of it. I think an additional level of complexity is also introduced with the use of Gen AI now, because we are actively exposing these autonomous agents to real users that are connected to multiple different systems. So yeah, if you're working with you have to be really careful when you do that, and make sure that you have security protocols in place to prevent people from accessing stuff they shouldn't be able to access, by
Yes.
design. That's the way that you solve that. But I mean, when it comes to explainability and tracing and things like that, it's also incredibly difficult because these models are often black boxes. They're often services that are hosted by other people. They're so big anyway that it would be infeasible to be able to generate any kind of explainability on the fly. And so yeah, you end up with these difficult these very powerful but difficult to govern black boxes. Um, so yeah, with regards to the regulation, one of the ways that people are asking developers to handle that is, one of the simple ones is to ensure that all generated output is marked as being generated by an algorithm, because it can be quite hard to
Mhm.
distinguish as a user whether output has been, content has been generated by an algorithm or a person. And um, it's important in many applications for the user to know that. I think another good sort of governance practice on that side as well is to so transparency is probably the first principle. The second principle is to have some robust user feedback mechanism, whether that be um, uh, rating, ranking results, or maybe a complaints procedure, or a way to get help or something like that. But just making it really easy for people to ask questions and complain when things go wrong. So you at least know about it. So yeah, sort of two sort of general principles there in any AI model that I think is important.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so I think that sort of rounds out the topic really well. So let's try and make some concluding thoughts. I think the people that are going to be most interested in this conversation is, I want to get started with AI in my business. I haven't really thought about strategy yet. I probably need to. What do you think that their next steps should be? Like, how do they actually get started coming up with their strategy? What should be on their priority list? What should they do first?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. I think so. In terms of AI specifically, I think having some understanding of what's available and what you can do is helpful, because it helps shaping your thinking. So if you're completely new to if you're kind of just starting out, then just understanding, what is reinforcement learning, what is, and how might or where might that be applied, even at a high level, is a useful starting point. Likewise with generative AI, it's the same sort of thing. So we haven't really talked about reinforcement learning, but there are a whole variety of places where, for sort of manufacturing automation, those sorts of places, reinforcement learning is really strong. Energy management is another one. It's used a lot in finance for algorithmic trading, for portfolio management, all sorts of places. So understanding, at a high level, like that's a technology that might apply is really useful. So just spending a bit of time doing some fairly high level work on understanding, as I say, what the capabilities are, what some of the technologies are, is really helpful. Um, but again, to re-emphasize the point we made at the beginning, the other part of this is, make sure you've actually sat there and thought about, well, what is it we're trying to do? What is it we're optimizing for? Don't make the mistake of going, where can I jam this generative AI thing in, and will it make any difference? The other thing that I would really emphasize is trying to make space and time for the people that work within the organization to try things and experiment. And often there's a sort of interesting problem with strategy work, which is it requires a slightly different mindset from the sort of day-to-day operational stuff. And so it's very hard to say to someone that's got a business unit to run, oh, by the way, can you do strategy as well? Because they're running a business unit, and that's a full-time job. And you know, you need to be able to sort of step out of the operational role to think strategically. But yeah, at a super high level, I think just getting some sense of where are the places where this might be useful is good, and then it's, you know, it's sort of normal business systems thinking stuff. It's, you know, what am I optimizing for? Where are my bottlenecks? Might this technology give me an edge? And then maybe throw it to somebody and say, can you play? I think this might be interesting. What do you think? Can you play with it a bit and get back to me? That sort of idea. As I say, it is going to be experimental. Not every experiment's going to work, but I think that's got to be your starting point, really. Yeah. What would your thoughts be?
Okay, no, that's good stuff. Yeah, my thoughts. I mean, I'm no expert on strategy at all. I think you've nailed it on the head. You need to have some broad understanding of the art of the possible in order to, then apply that thinking to your current business. But I would also draw it back. I would also come back to what you said right at the start, though, about focusing on first, figure out what you're actually trying to do. Are you developing a product? Are you trying to optimize for efficiency? Are you trying to reduce costs? Are you trying to save time? The high level goal of the project, I think that sets the direction. And then based upon that, start refining your hypotheses to run as experiments. I think that's a great way of thinking. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Great.
Okay, so I think that's it. I would like to thank you so much for joining me today. If anyone has any questions for Charles, then please feel free to email me at phil@winder.ai, and I'll make sure that Charles gets them. If you'd like to learn any more about AI, then you can visit our website, winder.ai, or you can email me directly, and I'd love to talk to you. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you, Charles.
Well, absolute pleasure. Thanks, Phil. That was great.